beautiful souls. Today I wanted to introduce you to some more spiritual books that I find very essential for spiritual practice, core truth that need to be understood by everybody. Doesn't matter if they're beginners, doesn't matter if they're intermediate, doesn't matter if they are advanced practitioners. Certain basic truths we must know, and not only conceptually, but actually embody through the practice of yoga and meditation, so those divine principles manifest through us, are extending themselves through us into what you could consider the physical experience. Now, one book that I forgot to mention in my first video about powerful spiritual books is an outright classic. It is a Ramana Maharishi collection. Now, what is so powerful about Ramana Maharishi's teaching? In my first video, and for those who haven't watched it, I will put a link in the description below, so you might want to catch up and then continue with this video. In my previous video, I spoke about basic spiritual books, but basic is not a derogatory term here. It means essential, absolutely essential to understand and to master. And I focused on Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now and certain Zen books, for example, of Suzuki, that focus on the idea of how can we transcend the ego, how can we get past the ego, how can we observe the ego to not be caught in it. Now, Ramana Maharishi's method leads to the same place. It's just a different type of yoga. It is jhana yoga. Well, what is jhana yoga? It is the wisdom yoga, the yoga of discernment. And he describes in here how we can use the intellectual mind in reverse, so it actually transcends itself and we step out of it. While in Zen practice, we mostly use the breath for that, to step out, to have all our attention in the sensation of breath, and therefore seeing the mind like a projection screen, not to be identified with it, not to be caught in it. Ramana Maharishi's method is different. While the Buddhist method is the idea of starving the ego out through non-reactivity, his method is to disrupt the ego mind constantly with the thought, who am I? Who am I? I would actually modify this a little bit and move it into the thought of who is I? Let's go there and let's speak about why. Because every time our mind wants to instigate suffering, it starts with an I thought. Or it starts with the idea of owning something. Mine. Yeah, the word mine appears a lot. My wife, my job, my this, my that. Yeah, and every suffering thought begins with I. Now, when we start questioning this I, who is I? The moment the thought arises, who is I? We disrupt the ego construct every single time. And what we'll actually find out if we keep asking this question, that the ego doesn't really exist, because every time we ask this question, the mind actually tries to hone in on the answer and it arrives in emptiness because the ego isn't real. So watch yourselves, watch your own thoughts right now and see when the I thought arises and you ask, who is I? Doesn't it create a sudden gap where you feel something beyond thought, something still, something ever present? So the idea of disrupting the mind in such a way can also lead to samadhi. Therefore, the practice of Zen or Ramana Maharishi's practice of self-inquiry actually lead into the same realization. It is important to know. So for some of you who are dealing with excessive accumulated egoic thought, this might be a proper method for you. Now, in the book, there's a collection of dialogues of him with his students, but also poetry that allows you to sense something beyond the mind. An utterly essential book. If you've never heard about Ramana Maharishi, I highly recommend it. Now, what else do I have on this pile for you guys today? Well, one of my personal favorites that I thoroughly enjoyed reading. This is Alan Watts' The Way of Zen. Now, how dare a Westerner write about Zen? Shouldn't the Asians have the monopoly on this? Of course not. And the reason they shouldn't have the monopoly on this is very, very simple. It is because many of the mystics in the West are actually on some level remembering their past lives in the East, and that's why even someone like Alan Watts, who comes back as a British man into that type of form and identity, breaks out of it, falls in love with Taoism, falls in love with Buddhism and Zen, falls in love with reading the Bhagavad Gita. Why? Because that's his karma, because in other lifetimes that's the work he has already done. So of course he feels re-attracted. Now, the Way of Zen does not really offer much advice in terms of practicality. That means in terms of actual applied practice. But why do I enjoy this so much? Because Alan Watts simply gets it. This is a wonderful book about the history of Zen Buddhism. Yeah? How Bodhidharma went to China, met the Taoists, yeah? And then the birth of Mahayana Buddhism, of Chan Buddhism, which is the Chinese word for Zen, is Chan. So basically the marriage of Taoism and Mahayana Buddhism led to Zen. And the beauty of Zen is that it is a practice without fluff, without empty rituals, without much focus on a scholastic approach, but a very direct approach of getting to it via meditation. Very powerful yoga, and this is the history of it, very beautifully described in modern English. Poetic, maybe one of his works that seems more academic than his other books, but maybe that's why I like it. Even though I'm not into anything academic myself much, because a lot of times academics don't see the forest for the trees. Alan does. So I highly recommend The Way of Zen. Now, a classic that always needs to be mentioned. Maybe one of the most powerful books ever written, because it goes so deep. In a way similar to Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, in terms of the depth that it touches, the essence of being, the emptiness, shunya, the state of nirvana, eternal stillness, now. Well, what book could it be? The Dao De Jing by Lao Tzu. Now, a little warning here. This version that I have received here is a horrible translation. And when it comes to translations of the Dao De Jing, it's similar to translations of the Bhagavad Gita. Simply when academics get to it, they miss the poetry, they don't see the meta connection, they get lost in details, and the true meaning is very distorted sometimes. I once found a audiobook version of the Dao De Jing that was publicized on YouTube, that is very, very powerful and accurate, and it can get you into a deep, deep state of meditation. The Dao De Jing is an absolute classic. And there's a beautiful story to it, because Master Lao Tzu, when he was about to leave his body, which the people around him did not know, but first he wanted to leave the city, he walked out of the city, and I'm not so sure if it was the local lord, the emperor, but somebody said, don't let this master leave because he has not written down his knowledge. And it would be a great loss. So a guard intercepts him at the gate and says, Master, you're allowed to leave, but only if you write down your wisdom. Then you can finally leave the city and do whatever you're planning to do. But this would be a great loss for humanity if you walk out without writing everything down. So the guards of the city then force him to write down his knowledge. And he writes the Dao De Jing. Now, Lao Tzu, of course, in his humility will say that he has nothing to teach. But this is exactly the greatest teaching that exists, the teaching of nothingness, of how to suspend the mind, surrender to Buddha mind, and then let that intelligence that is not intellectual, but much, much wiser and deeply eternally knowing, to let that take over. And as Lao Tzu once said, can you be still and sit until the right action arises by itself? It has to do with the suspension of desire, the suspension of control, until we achieve stillness, and then we let a higher power work through us, and therefore transmitting the Dharma and bringing the world back into balance and transcending our attachment to identity and the world itself as well. Very important book, highly recommend. But with any books I recommend, when you read them, please meditate while you read. Don't think and analyze, watch your breath while you read, and you will have a much deeper experience of connecting with such holy scripture. Now, the next one. Another great classic. The Gospel of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna. What a particular individual. A great saint of India. Why is the Gospel of Ramakrishna so important, and why is it so important right now? It is important because the Westerner has lost his ability to be devout, to yearn for God, to love God, to adore God, to pray to God. The Westerner goes about spiritual practice in a very, I would sometimes say, even a bit like a pathologist, cutting open the dead body and trying to figure out how it died. So the Westerner has a hard time making spirituality lively, bringing life into it, because the Westerner is caught in the intellect, and to the intellect everything is a surgery. There is no sweetness in the intellect, there is no love in the intellect. And therefore, the Gospel of Ramakrishna is a story of intense yearning for God. Ramakrishna used to be a tantric practitioner. He was a priest to the deity Kali. And his story is quite famous because even though he was a temple priest and he was praying to Kali, let's say all day, there's barely anything that he could focus on. He wasn't interested in women, he wasn't interested in materialism, he could only think of the goddess. So the embodiment of Shakti, the universal energy. And he reached a point of such yearning that he was suffering greatly. He felt a great desperation, and he said to the deity, if you don't appear to me, I know there's a sword in this temple as a decoration. I'm going to get it and I'm going to throw myself onto the sword if you don't manifest right now. And then she manifests. And this is then a beautiful story of divine communion, an embodiment of Shakti. Now, why is this then so essential? Because Ramakrishna, even though he did understand the proper methods of yoga, he did understand Tantra, he did understand higher forms of meditation, the yearning for the Divine Mother was the yearning that a child feels when it is missing its mother, but in this case, the universal mother, the mother of our souls. And this innocent, meek, in a way, beautifully naive yearning for the mother that he used in a tantric way, where he collected all his energy and withdrew it from worldly attention and focused it like a laser beam on the yearning for meeting the Divine Mother, brought him into the realization of God. This is what a lot of Westerners are missing. As I often say, we need devotion, we need bhakti, and we need jhana, wisdom. And the marriage of both is very powerful, but somebody may come to the proper conclusions through bhakti alone or through jhana alone. But together, they are much more potent. Now, why is this book also very fun to read? Because it's mostly dialogues. It's very personable. Even his experiences, there where you see the human side of things, where you see the struggle for spiritual truth, the loneliness of the master sometimes in the face of ignorant people, and the pressure that he was under. Very relatable spiritual teacher. There's a great feeling sense in the book. It's not just sterile, it's very lively. And also very important, what Ramakrishna focused on, like many other great yogis like Sri Yukteswar, is the unification of faith. Ramakrishna met Muslims, Christians, many different practitioners, and he would practice all religions and find God all the same. And that is important to understand, that we find the core truth in all teachings and stop seeing what separates us, but actually what brings us into fusion and brings us together. So for you Westerners who are very intellectual about spirituality and struggle with faith and are in a way terrified of faith because you're afraid if you are developing faith and a deep yearning for God that you become less smart, that you are giving up your sovereignty, well, if you believe that, don't fear, read the Gospel of Ramakrishna. Highly recommend. Now, usually I don't do this, but today is the day. This is my own book, Beyond Psychotherapy, The Laughing God Behind the Masks. Well, why do I bring it out now? Because the way this book developed was quite interesting for me in my own experience. Because when I started originally awakening, and I started remembering being a Zen monk from the medieval times of Japan, this is how it started out, where suddenly all the Zen Buddhist methods I started channeling and writing them down into this book. And a lot of anecdotes are in there, Zen koans, pointers of how to overcome ego in a very simplified modern English version, but the essence is Japanese Zen through and through. So I very enjoyed writing that, but then interestingly something happened during the process of writing this book, that the book became more and more advanced. It seems to write itself. So I moved from then Zen practice to more advanced forms of yoga, to describing mystical encounters, for example, with spiritual masters, some past life recollections that I'm sharing there. And the book moves from describing the basic methods of, for example, psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and how mindfulness and Zen Buddhism actually transcends that. That psychotherapy wants to correct the mind, while true spirituality is about going above and beyond the mind, and how to achieve that. And I described this then a little bit from the scientific perspective, and then I let go of that, go in the Zen Buddhist perspective, and then enter more and more a perspective of yoga, mysticism, and proper occult practice. Yeah, but this is the light side of practice, yeah? The white magic kind of practice, and not the practice that the ego wants to practice because it seeks power. So in the sense, this book went through a beautiful evolution, and therefore I cannot really place it like many of the books that before I've recommended, even in the previous video, where I pointed out like this book is very important for beginners or for intermediate practitioners, or this is more advanced. This book has a little bit of everything. It has the essence of practice, then a little bit more advanced yoga, and then abstract mystical philosophy that describes divine law based on a higher understanding, a download of the proper physics of how things work. Maybe you might be interested in that. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I really enjoy making these videos to share my passion with you. Thank you for listening, my friends. Be well.